This is MIDI Mod. MIDI Mod is a set of modules designed to work with MIDI-enabled devices, which could be hardware, software, or other apps on an iPad just like this. And when you break it down, it consists of three main modules. You have an LFO module, which consists of 4 LFOs. You have the envelope module, which has 2 standard ADSR envelopes, but with the addition of a delay and hold. And then you have this along the bottom, a third envelope that has an additional stage, and it also has individual level controls for each stage. And it also has delay and hold. The third module is the Arpeggiator module, and on the surface it doesn't really look like much. It has the basic functions that you would find in most any arpeggiator these days, but it has the inclusion of this auto sequencer on the right hand side, which is really powerful and allows you to do some cool stuff. And this is the massive 32 slot mod matrix, which you can use to send modulation to all sorts of MIDI destinations. You can see here in the source list, we have all the LFOs, the envelopes, and then if you plug a keyboard into your iPad like this one here, you have all these other sources as well. So you've got Aftertouch, velocity, note, which is just the note being played, Modwheel, Pitchbend, expression, and then as I mentioned with the arpeggiator, you have you can trigger modulation with a note on or note off in the arpeggiator. For today, I'm using the Yamaha Reface CS in conjunction with the Arturia Keystep as a controller. I have the Arturia Keystep hooked up to the iPad via the camera connection kit, straight out of the USB for the Arturia, and then I have MIDI DIN going from the Keystep into the back of the Reface, and then in addition I've got a Korg Volca sample hooked up, which we'll talk about later. So to add a second LFO to the Reface, we can just push the little plus button, select Arturia Keystep because that's our intermediary between the MIDI Mod app and the Reface. And I'll just scroll down to Yamaha, and then we want the Reface CS. And let's do, with the patch you heard at the beginning, I was modulating LFO speed. So let's do that again. So a pretty typical thing to do with an LFO is to modulate the rate of one with another. So that's exactly what we'll do here. And then why don't we just turn it on and see what it sounds like. Just flip the toggle switch at the top to enable it. So what's happening is the LFO for MIDI Mod is essentially just controlling the speed fader on the Reface CS, moving it up and down. And we can change the way in which that works by changing the LFO shape. Right now we're on triangle. We can go saw. Square. Make it a little bit faster. Now we do have this rate control switch, which allows us to go from slow to fast. I'm going to turn up the depth on the Reface so it's a little more obvious. Now, you might be wondering, well, why does this only go up to, 10? That is configurable. So if we come into the settings screens, you'll see this LFO max rate option, and then you can go ahead and drag that all the way to the right, and the maximum value is 40. So now if we come back into here, you can see that we can get all the way up to 40 hertz on the LFO speed. And it kind of depends on the gear you're interacting with, how well that's actually going to translate. So, well, let's just give it a shot and see how it sounds here. Actually, what we should do is we should just change this to something simple, like the filter cutoff. Can do that in the mod matrix. So once again, you just tap on the destination. And let's do filter cutoff this time. That should make it really easy to hear. I'm going to cut the LFO out of the reface altogether. Just turn it off. It's not too bad. Okay, let's talk about some of the other LFO features. We've got this BPM button up top, and what that does is it will just, whatever you do here, you're not like in free range mode anymore. It's going to lock it into a subdivision of the current tempo. So 4 bars. Oh, we're in square, so now this is going to take too long. Yeah, let's go back to sine. And we can go all the way up to 30-second notes. You've got a sync mode, which actually just syncs to some other LFO as a source. So you can lock the rates of multiple LFOs together with that. We've already gone through some of the waveforms. There's an additional one up top called user, and then you can press this edit button, and this is essentially a shortened wavetable editor. So let's just make up some weird shape and hear what it sounds like. Kind of an irregular pattern. And then if you turn off smooth, it will just jump between the positions. Kind of a little bit more like sample and hold. If you turn the rate up, it probably will sound like that. A little bit. And then you have a delay function, which you can use to, when you've got it paired up with a keyboard, or even using the on-screen keyboard. You will press a key, and then the LFO won't have any effect until after that certain amount of time. So this is another thing that's configurable in the settings, this max delay time, so you can make it really, really super long, or you can shorten it up a bit. So now if I bring it down there, or even if I bring it up here, it'll be relatively short compared to what we just heard. The key button will just restart the LFO waveform when a key is pressed. So that's all that does. Otherwise, it's kind of just continuously running. Turn off the delay. See, these are kind of some standard options that you'd expect to find on if you were to buy some sort of dedicated LFO module. And then this depth is the master depth control, so it will affect all destinations for this LFO. Bring it down a little too low. And as we saw before, you can add assignments just by hitting the plus button here. One thing to note is each module can have up to 8 destinations, and that also goes for the 3 envelopes as well. So now that we know the basic functions of the LFO module, let's go ahead and do something a little more interesting. So all of MIDI Mod's parameters, almost all of them, can be internally modulated and controlled. So if we want to modulate one LFO with another one of MIDI Mod's LFOs, we can just select MIDI Mod from the drop-down list. And then you'll see the big giant list of all the things we can modulate. So scroll all the way down, 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 until we find LFO. Let's just go with rate, LFO1 rate. Then maybe we'll BPM sync this one to, I don't know, 4 bars. Turn it on. So there we go. Now we've got this LFO modulating the rate of this LFO. So let's use the envelopes to make this more interesting. We've got 2 ADSR style envelopes and then 1 multi-stage envelope that has individual level controls for each stage. They all have delay and hold, and they're all loopable. So we can either, for looping options, we can have it run through the entire cycle, or we can sync it to re-trigger according to any of these sources. But for now, let's just use it like a regular old envelope and trigger it with the keyboard. So for our destination, let's select LFO1 depth. So that'll be the amount that the LFO actually has. That'll be the effect that the LFO actually has on the filter of the reface. LFO1 depth. Turn it on with the toggle switch and so the intensity at which the LFO1 is actually modulating the Reface CS filter is changing. Let's make this a little bit more dramatic. Bring our rate down. Now, envelope has configurable parameters as well. You can set the max attack time for each. So we're playing with envelope 1. We can bring that way up, make it a really long attack. And I'll just stop right there. Let's do something fun with the third envelope. Since we've got all those individual level controls, let's do Pitchbend. Pretend this is an ADSR first. So ignore the first T1 and L1, and then treat T2 as your attack. and then set L2 to the max. And then T3 is your decay, and L3 is your sustain. T4 is your release. Turn it on, filter back up. Alright, let's bring in some of the other stuff. Now the one thing here is if we play this now, we're actually an octave lower than we should be. We have to reset by hitting the Pitchbend lever like that. In order to avoid having to do that, we can come into the mod matrix and restrict the range of values. So let's set the bottom end of the range to 63. And now, after we release the key, we should be right. So now we're right where we started. So normally you might not think of Pitchbend as being something to modulate, but it's actually kind of fun. And you could loop this for even more fun. Add a little hold. I'll just leave delay off. So, kind of fun. We'll turn that off. Okay, let's talk about the mod matrix, which is a critical component of the app. It has 32 slots. You have many sources to choose from, and your destinations, you've got over 50 devices in here already, and then you can always make up your own. So if you choose manual or learn, you can just punch in a value. You can do sysx too, by the way. I think 71 is resonant on the Reface. Let's see. Oh yes. Okay, sorry about that. Why don't we just delete that mod for now? You can delete any mod in a mod slot just by pressing and holding on it and then confirming. And then it's gone. Let's do some of the more expressive ones. So since we've got this keyboard hooked up, we can do things like Aftertouch. Maybe we'll set that to the LFO rate. How about that? LFO speed, and have LFO speed modulate, or excuse me, the LFO on the Reface. Let's make that modulate pitch. I don't know if you can hear it very much, but it's like, there, now you can hear it. And you can also assign velocity. That might be a fun one as well. So if you whack it really hard, it's so fast that you can hardly hear it. But if you hit it softly, And then you could also do Modwheel. And expression, I don't have a pedal hooked up right now. You could use Pitchbend. We can use ARP note on and ARP note off to send modulation as well. Alright, let's talk about the Arpeggiator. This Arpeggiator has a lot of the basic features you'd find on most arpeggiators these days, and it also has this auto sequencer section, which is really cool, and we'll talk about that later. Let's run through some of the basics. First, I'm going to choose my device, and then turn it on. The on button is in the toolbar this time. There's no toggle. It's just in the toolbar. That way you can easily turn it on and off from wherever you are in the app. Okay, so now we've chosen our device, and then we can go ahead and play. For this, I'm just going to use the on-screen keyboard for fun. Now let's turn on latch mode, because that's where things get interesting, as we'll see in a bit. Bring the decay down just to make this a little more plucky sounding. Alright, so you got your basic patterns. Run through all of them, and then you can go up or down 2 octaves. Note repeats, you can do up to 8. And then subdivision goes from quarter note up to 32nd. You have triplets at 8th note and 16th. And then you can control the gate length. Now you'll see there's a couple different things down here that you might not normally have in an arpeggiator, and that's the velocity control and decay amount. When you turn on velocity control and move the slider up and down, that will just set it to a particular velocity. If you use the decay feature, you can actually make the velocity fade over time. Or you can make it increase over time. So auto sequencer is basically a transpose sequencer. So you can transpose your arpeggio by pressing the transpose button and then pressing any key, and it'll move it to that root note. But with the auto sequencer, you can have it walk up or down any scale. I shouldn't say any scale, but all kinds of different types of scales. And then there is a user editable section where you can basically enter your own steps. And we'll just play around and you'll hear what I'm talking about as soon as we get going. So I'm just going to do latch mode again and just a single note, because this is the easiest way to understand it. You can think of it as a sequencer of a sequence. And in this case, it'll be a one-note sequence. All right, here we go. So it's like walking up a major chord. If we press the scale button, it'll hit the individual notes in the scale. step is the number of steps it will walk, and you can go up to 16, I believe. Yep. Chromatic. And weirder things like augmented, whole tone. Which is basically the sci-fi de facto scale. Alright, I'm gonna put the number of steps back down and turn it off. So hopefully that makes sense with just the one note going, but let's see what happens now if we enter even just a simple 4-note pattern. Alright, so latch mode again, and I'm gonna do something like this. Now I'm gonna set the playback pattern to as played. And how about we double up the notes? Still not terribly interesting because chromatic isn't all that interesting. Sometimes it is. Let's make up our own pattern. Alright, so here are the 16 steps. Up or down, 24 semitones. Let's go with, kind of look at this as a guitar almost. That's how I think of it. Up 3 half steps, down to 1 half step, and then up 4 half steps. And turn that to user. Notice that the little flashes around the notes stop happening, and that's because it's transposing and it's no longer playing the notes that are shown here on the display. So hopefully that gives you a good feel for what the auto sequencer can do. As long as we're here on the Arpeggiator screen, it's probably a good time to talk about MIDI clock and MIDI sync. So one thing we can do is we can sync MIDI Mod's tempo to incoming MIDI clock. So if we come back into the settings and choose clock source Keystep, and then we press the sync button, we'll now be locked to the Keystep's tempo. So we'll do our little simple sequence again. Arpeggio, I mean. So apparently the Keystep doesn't send out MIDI clock unless you've got a sequence running. I apologize for that atrocious sound, but you can clearly see here that the tempo is changing as I adjust it on the Keystep. Then if I stop the sequence, the rate knob doesn't do anything. So that shows how MIDI Mod can be synced to an outside external MIDI clock. You can also send MIDI Mod's tempo to a device, and you have this little analog sync out. Some of you may have noticed this little cable plugged into the back. What that's for, I actually have a Volca sample. Okay, hopefully you can see that. And I have this from the headphone jack plugged right into the Volca sync in. So, see, I got this little groove on here. And now if I plug this in, it stops because it's waiting for an incoming pulse. And we can send it that pulse with MIDI Mod. So for the Volca, you'll want to set the subdivision to 8th note. It even gives you a little helpful Volca right there and on the screen, and then just flip the toggle switch. And we can too slow. Alright, now that I've got my camera back in position, let's talk about some of the other settings. We've gone over some of the clock settings. We've got control inputs. What that is if you want to have another device to set up like MIDI learn mappings. Actually, there's already a comprehensive, full-fledged parameter list. So if you open the user guide, you'll see all of MIDI Mod's controllable parameters. So you can set up your own, if you have a device, you can set up your own mappings. You can also use MIDI learn to, for anything. So let's see, let's set control inputs to the Keystep, the ARP swing amount. Now it's listening for a MIDI CC, so we have to send it one. There. I just sent it the Modwheel because I don't know if there's anything else I can use on the Keystep. But now what that means is we can use the Modwheel on the Keystep to control the Arpeggiator swing amount. So let's go ahead and get a little sequence going. You can see the swing control moving as I play around with the Modwheel. So there you go, real easy to do for any parameter. You just come into the settings and do it with MIDI learn. Turn that back off, and let's see what else we got. You can see these favorite slots. Now you may have noticed how tedious it was for me to select the manufacturer, select the device, and then the parameter, in the MIDI channel every time I was making an assignment. So what you can do with favorites is basically set up shortcuts. So select the channel you want and then the device mapping. So Yamaha Reface CS. And then what that allows me to do now is from the mod matrix or one of the LFOs or envelopes or whatever, now I can just come into here and make an assignment, and it shows up after I select my output device. It'll show up right at the top. If I choose other, then I'll go back down into the navigation menus that we saw before, but you can see right here Reface CS is right at the top. So that's how you set up a favorite. You have the user guide built in to the app right down here, and you've got all these other settings. We've covered most of them, I think. Envelope max time, LFO delay max time, LFO max rate. AT delay time is if you're using Aftertouch as a modulation source, you might not want the effects to kick in right away because Aftertouch tends to be really highly variable depending on the keyboard. So if you've got a really sensitive keyboard and you don't want to be sending off modulation right away, you might want to dial this up a little bit. You have the ARP split point, so we didn't talk about that, but in the Arpeggiator you've got the ability to split both sides of the keyboard, and then max MIDI messages per second. You can use this to either increase or decrease the number of MIDI messages that will be sent out, like by an LFO, for instance. And the last thing I'll mention is that you have the ability to save presets. So to do that, just press the save button, give it a name, and there you go. And then you can recall it at any time. You can see all the different ones I have here. I hope that gives you a good idea of what MIDI Mod is all about. Feel free to leave me questions, comments, concerns in the comments below. You can also get a hold of me at eokuwi@gmail.com. That's EOKUWWY@gmail.com. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have fun.